The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty frontier town of Cedar Ridge as Thomas McKenna rode through the main street on his weathered horse. His clothes were travel-worn, his face marked by days of hard riding under the scorching desert sun. The townspeople watched him with curious eyes, whispering among themselves about the stranger who had arrived just as the town was preparing for its most controversial event in years. Thomas had come to Cedar Ridge following rumors that had reached him in the neighboring territory. Stories spoke of a man named William Carter, a local rancher who was scheduled to face the executioner's noose in 3 days. The official charges claimed Carter had murdered a traveling merchant and stolen his gold, but something about the entire situation felt wrong to Thomas. He had known Carter years ago, and the man he remembered was honest to his core, someone who would give his last dollar to help a neighbor in need. As Thomas dismounted outside the local saloon, he noticed the unusual tension in the air. The townspeople moved quickly, avoiding eye contact with strangers. Children were kept close to their mothers, and even the stray dogs seemed to sense something was amiss. The wooden buildings that lined the street appeared normal enough, but there was an underlying current of fear that made Thomas's instincts sharp. Inside the saloon, the bartender was a nervous man with thinning hair and shaking hands. When Thomas asked about the upcoming execution, the man's face went pale. He served the whiskey without making eye contact and mumbled something about justice being served. But Thomas caught the tremor in his voice, the way his eyes darted toward the stairs leading to the upper rooms. "Heard tell William Carter's getting hanged," Thomas said casually, watching the bartender's reaction carefully. The man's hands froze while wiping down a glass. "That's right, stranger. Man killed poor old Samuel Morrison, the merchant. Took his gold and left him to die on the old mining road." Thomas nodded slowly, but his trained eye caught the details that didn't add up. The bartender's story sounded rehearsed, like words he had been forced to memorize. When Thomas pressed for more details about the crime, the man became increasingly uncomfortable, eventually excusing himself to attend to other customers who weren't even there. Later that evening, Thomas made his way to the town jail, a small stone building at the end of the street. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Bradford, was initially reluctant to let Thomas see the prisoner. But when Thomas mentioned he was an old friend of Carter's, Bradford's demeanor changed. There was something calculating in his eyes, as if he was weighing options Thomas couldn't yet understand. William Carter looked like a broken man when Thomas finally saw him. The rancher who had once been strong and proud now sat hunched in his cell, his clothes dirty and torn. But when he looked up and recognized Thomas, a spark of hope flickered in his eyes. "Tom," Carter whispered, gripping the iron bars. "I didn't think anyone would come." "Tell me what really happened, Will," Thomas said, keeping his voice low. Carter glanced nervously toward the sheriff's office, then leaned closer to the bars. "I never killed Samuel Morrison. I found his body on the mining road, but he was already dead when I got there. When I tried to help him, Sheriff Bradford and his men showed up. They said I was caught red-handed, but Tom, I swear on my mother's grave, I was just trying to help." Thomas studied his old friend's face. Years of reading people had taught him to recognize truth, and he saw it clearly in Carter's desperate eyes. "Who else was there that day?" "That's the strange part," Carter continued. "There were horse tracks all around the body, fresh ones. But Bradford made his men trample over everything before I could point them out. And Morrison's gold, they found it in my saddlebags. But Tom, I never put it there. Someone planted it." The conversation was interrupted by heavy footsteps approaching. Sheriff Bradford appeared, his hand resting casually on his gun. "Time's up, stranger. Prisoner needs his rest before the big day." As Thomas walked back to his room at the boarding house, his mind raced with questions. The pieces of this puzzle didn't fit together the way they should. An honest man like Carter doesn't suddenly become a murderer and thief. The planted evidence, the nervous townspeople, the rehearsed story from the bartender, all pointed to something much larger than a simple robbery gone wrong. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He stood by his window looking out at the quiet street below. In the distance, he could see the wooden gallows being constructed in the town square, its dark silhouette against the starlit sky serving as a grim reminder of what was to come. The sound of hammering echoed through the night as workers continued their macabre task. He decided to investigate further. Something was happening in Cedar Ridge, something that required an innocent man to die to keep it hidden. Thomas had seen corruption before in frontier towns, but this felt different. The level of control, the fear in people's eyes, suggested an organized conspiracy that reached deep into the town's power structure. As he prepared for what lay ahead, Thomas made a silent promise to his old friend. He would uncover the truth no matter how dangerous it became. The executioner might be preparing his noose, but Thomas McKenna was preparing for war. The next morning brought Thomas closer to the truth he was seeking, but also deeper into danger. He had spent the early hours before dawn riding out to the old mining road where Samuel Morrison's body had been discovered. The area had been trampled and disturbed just as Carter had described, but Thomas's keen eyes found what the sheriff's men had missed. Hidden beneath a fallen log, partially buried by recent rains, Thomas discovered a distinctive brass button. It was expensive, the kind worn by wealthy men, and it bore an intricate design that looked familiar. He pocketed the evidence and continued his search, finding more clues that painted a picture very different from the official story. The hoofprints that remained told their own tale. 3 horses had been present at the scene, not just Carter's mount and Morrison's wagon horse. The third set of tracks belonged to a shod horse, well-maintained and expensive, the kind ridden by someone with money and status. These tracks led away from the scene toward the eastern hills, where the wealthy residents of Cedar Ridge had their large properties. When Thomas returned to town, he noticed increased activity around the sheriff's office. Several well-dressed men were coming and going, their faces serious and their conversations hushed. He recognized one of them as Judge Harrison, the man who had presided over Carter's hasty trial. Another was Mayor Blackwood, a portly man with cold eyes who owned half the businesses in town. Thomas decided to visit the local general store, hoping to learn more about the mysterious brass button. The storekeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, examined the button carefully when Thomas showed it to her. "My goodness," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "This is from Judge Harrison's coat. I sold him a set just like this last month. But, mister, you shouldn't be asking about such things. It's not safe." Before Thomas could ask what she meant, Mrs. Patterson quickly wrapped the button in a cloth and handed it back to him. "There are ears everywhere in this town," she warned. "People who ask too many questions have a way of disappearing." Her words sent a chill down Thomas's spine, but they also confirmed his growing suspicions. The conspiracy ran deeper than he had imagined, involving the very people who were supposed to uphold justice in Cedar Ridge. That afternoon, Thomas decided to take a different approach. He had noticed that the town's telegraph operator, a young man named Billy, seemed nervous whenever certain people were around. Thomas waited until the boy was alone and approached him carefully. "Billy," Thomas said softly, "I think you know something about what really happened to Samuel Morrison." The young man's hands trembled as he looked around the empty telegraph office. "I can't say nothing, mister. They'll kill me if I talk." "Who will kill you?" Thomas pressed gently. Billy's eyes filled with tears. "The same people who killed Morrison. The same people who are going to let an innocent man hang for it." He paused, then continued in a whisper. "I saw the telegram they made me send that night. It wasn't about Carter at all. It was about Morrison carrying information that could destroy them all." The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Samuel Morrison hadn't been killed for his gold. He had been murdered because he knew something dangerous, something that threatened powerful people in Cedar Ridge. Carter had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, making him the perfect scapegoat. "What kind of information?" Thomas asked. Billy glanced toward the door again, then reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a copy of a telegram he had been ordered to destroy. Morrison was working for the territorial government. He was investigating reports of land fraud and illegal mining claims. He had proof that Judge Harrison, Mayor Blackwood, and Sheriff Bradford were stealing land from homesteaders and selling it to mining companies. Thomas read the telegram with growing anger. Morrison had discovered that the three most powerful men in Cedar Ridge were running a conspiracy that had cheated dozens of families out of their rightful property. The scheme involved falsifying legal documents, intimidating witnesses, and even murder when necessary. They killed him to stop him from reporting back to the territorial capital, Billy continued, and now they're going to hang Carter to close the case forever. Thomas folded the telegram carefully and put it in his pocket alongside the brass button. He now had evidence, but he also knew how dangerous his situation had become. If Billy was right, these men had already committed murder to protect their secret. They wouldn't hesitate to kill again. As evening approached, Thomas made his way back to the jail, hoping to update Carter on what he had learned. But when he arrived, he found the building surrounded by armed men. Sheriff Bradford emerged from the shadows, his gun drawn. "I hear you've been asking a lot of questions, stranger," Bradford said, his voice menacing. "Questions that could get a man hurt in a town like this." Thomas kept his hands visible, but his mind was racing. "Just trying to understand the facts before an innocent man dies." "The facts are simple," Bradford replied. "William Carter is a murderer, and justice will be served tomorrow morning. I suggest you ride out of town tonight while you still can." The threat was clear, but Thomas had no intention of abandoning his friend. As he walked away from the jail under the watchful eyes of Bradford's men, he knew he was running out of time. The execution was scheduled for dawn, less than 12 hours away. He needed a plan that would not only save Carter's life, but also expose the conspiracy that had already cost Samuel Morrison his life. The evidence he had gathered was compelling, but it would mean nothing if he couldn't present it to someone with the authority and courage to act on it. As Thomas returned to his room, he noticed shadows moving outside his window. He was being watched, probably had been since his arrival in town. The conspiracy's tentacles reached everywhere in Cedar Ridge, making trust a dangerous luxury he couldn't afford. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, and Thomas knew he would be facing it alone. Dawn was still an hour away when Thomas put his desperate plan into action. He had spent the sleepless night preparing for what he knew would be his only chance to save Carter and expose the conspiracy that had corrupted Cedar Ridge to its core. The town square was already filling with people as Thomas made his way toward the gallows. The atmosphere was tense, with Sheriff Bradford's armed men positioned strategically throughout the crowd. Thomas noticed that many of the townspeople looked uncomfortable, their faces showing the strain of living under the thumb of corrupt officials. Carter was brought out as the first rays of sunlight touched the wooden platform. He looked resigned to his fate, but when he spotted Thomas in the crowd, a flicker of hope returned to his eyes. The executioner, a hooded figure brought in from another territory, checked his rope one final time. Judge Harrison stepped forward to read the final judgment, his voice carrying across the silent square. "William Carter, you have been found guilty of the murder of Samuel Morrison and the theft of his property. Do you have any final words?" This was the moment Thomas had been waiting for. Before Carter could speak, Thomas stepped forward, his voice ringing out clearly across the square. "I have evidence that proves William Carter is innocent." A murmur ran through the crowd as all eyes turned to Thomas. Sheriff Bradford's hand moved toward his gun, but the presence of so many witnesses forced him to hesitate. "This man is a stranger with no authority here," Judge Harrison declared, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Thomas pulled out the brass button and the telegram, holding them high so everyone could see. Samuel Morrison wasn't killed for gold. He was murdered because he discovered that Judge Harrison, Mayor Blackwood, and Sheriff Bradford have been stealing land from homesteaders and selling it to mining companies illegally. The crowd erupted in shocked voices as Thomas continued his accusation. Many of the townspeople were homesteaders themselves, people who had struggled with mysterious legal challenges to their property rights. "This brass button came from Judge Harrison's coat," Thomas shouted over the noise. "I found it at the murder scene, where the sheriff claimed there was no evidence, and this telegram proves that Morrison was a territorial investigator, not just a traveling merchant." Judge Harrison's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain control. "These are lies and fabrications. This man is clearly working with Carter to escape justice." But Thomas wasn't finished. He had saved his most devastating revelation for last. Billy Patterson, the telegraph operator, has the original copy of the message Morrison sent to the territorial capital the night before he was murdered. It contains a complete list of the fraudulent land deals and the names of everyone involved. At this revelation, Mayor Blackwood stepped forward angrily. "Enough of this nonsense. Sheriff Bradford, arrest this man for interfering with a legal execution." Bradford started toward Thomas, but his path was blocked by members of the crowd who had begun to realize the truth of what they were hearing. These were people whose land had been stolen, whose families had been threatened, whose lives had been disrupted by the conspiracy Thomas was exposing. "Show us the evidence," someone called out from the crowd. "Let him speak," shouted another voice. Thomas seized the momentum. "Mrs. Patterson at the general store can identify this button as coming from a coat she sold to Judge Harrison. Billy Patterson has the telegraph records that prove Morrison's real identity, and I'm willing to bet that if you search Judge Harrison's property, you'll find Morrison's missing horse and wagon hidden where they thought no one would look." The accusation hit home. Thomas had been guessing about the horse and wagon, but the look of panic that crossed Harrison's face told him he had guessed correctly. Judge Harrison tried one last desperate move. "Even if these wild accusations were true, it changes nothing. Carter was found with the stolen gold. Gold that was planted in his saddlebags by Sheriff Bradford," Thomas replied. "Carter found Morrison's body and tried to help him, just as he said. But Bradford and his men were already there, waiting to pin the murder on whoever discovered it first." The crowd was becoming increasingly agitated. Several homesteaders began shouting about their own suspicious legal troubles, connecting their experiences to the conspiracy Thomas had revealed. The mood in the square was shifting dramatically against the corrupt officials. Sheriff Bradford made a fatal mistake in that moment. Realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control, he drew his gun and pointed it at Thomas. "You've said enough." But his action only confirmed Thomas's accusations in the minds of the townspeople. If Bradford was innocent, why would he resort to violence to silence the truth? Several men in the crowd rushed Bradford before he could fire. In the confusion that followed, Mayor Blackwood tried to escape, but he was quickly surrounded by angry citizens who had suffered under his corrupt administration. Judge Harrison, seeing that his conspiracy was completely exposed, made a desperate confession. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Morrison was supposed to just disappear like the others. But when he started asking questions at the land office, we had no choice." His words sealed his fate and confirmed everything Thomas had accused them of. The crowd erupted in angry shouts, demanding justice for all the crimes that had been committed in their name. Carter was cut down from the gallows by the executioner himself, who declared that he would not participate in the hanging of an innocent man. The real criminals were now the ones facing the judgment of the people they had oppressed. As order was slowly restored to the town square, Thomas helped Carter steady himself. His old friend was free, but the cost of that freedom had been high for everyone involved. "Thank you, Tom," Carter said quietly. "I thought I was going to die for something I didn't do." Thomas looked around at the townspeople, who were beginning to organize themselves to deal with the corrupt officials who had controlled their lives for so long. The truth has a way of coming out, Will. It just sometimes needs a little help. In the days that followed, territorial authorities arrived to investigate the conspiracy. The evidence Thomas had gathered, combined with testimony from Billy Patterson and other townspeople, led to the arrest and conviction of all those involved in Morrison's murder and the land fraud scheme. Cedar Ridge began the slow process of healing and rebuilding under honest leadership. The homesteaders who had lost their land were able to reclaim it, and the fear that had gripped the town for so long finally began to lift. Thomas stayed long enough to see Carter cleared of all charges and to testify at the trials of the real criminals. When it was time for him to move on, he rode out of Cedar Ridge, knowing that justice had been served and that an innocent man was alive because he had been willing to challenge the executioner and expose the brutal truth behind a frontier conspiracy.